Through the misty Wyoming pass, Clara Hawke grips the reins so tight her knuckles ache. The freight wagon creaks beneath crates of flour and salt, every wheel turn echoing like a dare against the mountain. Folks back in Cedar Hollow whisper she's reckless, a widow with no sense left but plenty of ghosts to keep her company. Maybe they're right. This endless road is the only place her husband's voice still rides beside her. "You always did love the hard way, Clara," she imagines him saying, soft as wind through pine. She chose these trails because safe paths don't quiet the ache, because no one asks questions when you're hauling supplies to the loneliest cabin the frontier ever forgot. And tonight, Clara mutters to the dark, "I'm done running from ghosts." Somewhere beyond that ridge, the truth waits. Clara Hawke learned to stand her ground long before she ever crossed the Wyoming Pass. On a patch of sunburnt land in Kansas, she was her father's right hand before she could even reach the top rung of the corral gate. She knew the weight of a hammer, the sharp bite of a splinter, the way earth smelled when it begged for rain that wouldn't come. Her father's hands were as cracked and stubborn as the soil. She'd hold them tight on long walks to the well, feeling each callus like a road map of every fence they'd fixed and every crop that failed. It was her mother, Annie, who taught her something softer but sharper too. When Clara turned 12, a fox came for the hens 3 nights in a row. The traps didn't catch it, the dogs didn't bark. Annie set her jaw one dusk, handed Clara an old rifle and whispered, "There's things in this world that'll take what you've worked for. You don't ask them to stop. You teach them why they shouldn't." The recoil nearly knocked Clara on her back. But when that fox never came back, she found something fierce inside herself. Something that wouldn't die easy. She thought that same fire would burn forever when she met Thomas Hawke. He was lean, all elbows and half smiles, a ranch hand who worked the land just south of theirs. He'd come by after branding, smelling of smoke and clover, slipping wildflowers into her hair when no one was looking. One spring he tucked a daisy behind her ear and said, "It's not much, but it's yours." Like me. They married under the cottonwoods, just them and the wind, and a Bible passed down so many generations, the pages curled like old parchment. They talked about building a proper house, raising cattle, maybe a baby or two if God was kind. But the Rio Grande came calling, a border skirmish wrapped in flags and promises that never felt real to Clara. He left with a kiss and his hat on her lap. He came back in a pine box with a bullet she never saw coming. At the burial, Clara wore a black dress 2 sizes too big, the hem caked in clay. The townsfolk gathered around, whispering that she was too young, too alone, too unlucky. The preacher's words scattered like dust on dry wind. Clara just stood there, fists balled, eyes dry, because tears couldn't change a coffin that small. Cedar Hollow never let her forget. The bank clerk smiled too kindly when he told her, "You'd be better off back east. Family's easier than soil out here." A rancher once laughed in her face when she asked for work. "Won't hire a woman who can shoot straighter than my boys, Clara Hawke." Wouldn't be right. And while Clara bore their stares, Elias Grant bore a different burden. The weight of betrayal that stripped him down to shadow and bone. Once he was the bright heir of Grant Basin Ranch. He and Lydia, his fiancée, would ride the fence lines at dusk, planning the chapel they'd build on the ridge, the children they'd raise inside its walls. But Lydia's smile hid a lawyer's trick and a pen's poison. The day she left, she took the cattle, the land titles, and the chapel sketch tucked in his coat pocket, all traded for a carriage ride back east and a last look over her shoulder that said, "You made it too easy." Elias stayed. He buried the dreams under frost and timber, and the ridge that once promised a family became the only place that didn't ask for what he could no longer give. Clara Hawke learned early that Cedar Hollow streets had eyes sharper than any hawk. The first time she dragged those crates up to the counter at Crossroads Provisions, the supply clerk squinted at the faded order slip like it might bite him. His beard was wiry, tobacco-stained, his eyes darting between her and the name scrawled at the bottom, E. Grant. He leaned in, voice low, like he was telling her a secret no one else should hear. "People don't come back from Cross Pine, girl. Best you run your wagons down to the rail depot or south to the Basin ranches. Safer trails, better coin." Clara just hitched her bag tighter on her shoulder. He needs goods. I'm bringing them. That's all that matters. But the clerk's warning clung to her like the Wyoming fog, settling under her skin, whispering in the rattle of the wagon wheels every mile up the ridge. Then there was the drifter. She found him hunched outside the Hollowhorn Saloon, boots caked with road dust, eyes sunk deep in his skull like he'd seen too much he wished he could forget. He called her over with a nod, tipping back his hat to reveal a half smirk and a missing tooth. "You the girl runs freight to Grant's Ridge?" he rasped, a finger tapping the rim of his battered tin cup. Clara bristled. "Who's asking?" The drifter chuckled, but the sound had no warmth. "That ridge swallows folks whole. Ain't just a man up there. Some debts don't stay buried, missy. Some ghosts walk the trails same as you and me." She left him with his cup and his crooked grin, but his words rattled around her skull every time the trees closed in and the shadows stretched long over the crosspine trail. The final seed of doubt came wrapped in a stale apple pie. Mrs. Lucille Holloway knocked on Clara's door one afternoon, the smell of cinnamon only half covering the scent of something gone to rot. Lucille settled her bulk at Clara's tiny table, eyes sharp as needles behind her lace kerchief. "Elias Grant," she said, slicing into the pie with unnecessary force. "They say he buried gold up there in that ridge, or a body, or maybe both. Some secrets grow fat in the dark, Clara. Don't think you're the first to try and dig 'em up." Charity. Clara forced a polite smile, but later that night, the untouched pie sat in the bin, and her mind wrestled with every story Cedar Hollow had ever whispered about the man behind the porch rail. Clara didn't notice the bird at first. She just finished unloading the crates, salt, flour, nails, and was stacking the last bundle of split logs by Elias Grant's porch when her eye caught the flicker of pale pine. Nestled between two thick pieces of firewood was a tiny hand-carved bird, rough but careful, its wings outstretched like it might take flight if the wind was kind enough. She turned it over in her palm, tracing the whittled lines with a thumb that trembled more than she'd admit. It took her back, to her mother's soft voice telling tales on cold nights when the wind rattled their Kansas farmhouse. The bird from those stories had carried messages to the lost, a promise that no one was ever truly alone, even in the darkest places. Clara tucked the carving deep into her coat pocket, where its edges pressed warm against her ribs. A week later, she decided to speak back in her own quiet way. She didn't have much to offer: a half sack of flour, a pinch of wild sage she'd dried on her windowsill, but she baked it into a rough round loaf all the same. She wrapped it carefully in her mother's last scrap of embroidered cloth. The stitches faded, but the memory still bright. She left it on the porch rail before dawn. No note, just trust. When she returned for the next run, the cloth was waiting, washed, pressed flat, folded so neat it felt almost holy. Balanced on top was a small glass jar, honey so golden it glowed even in the mountain's thin light. Clara lifted it to her lips, let a single drop touch her tongue, and wondered how sweetness could feel so much like hope. Then came the storm. The wind howled down Cross Pine like it was hunting something. Somewhere along the ridge, her wagon wheel gave a groan and snapped clean. She camped there that night, numb fingers clutched around the carving in her coat. Come morning, the wheel was mended, a fresh brace cut and fitted so snug it might have always been there, with two small letters carved into the grain. E.g. Sometimes, Clara thought, the quietest hands do the loudest mending. The frost was already biting at the hem of Clara's coat when she climbed the last rise toward Elias Grant's cabin. The mule's breath came in sharp clouds and her own words tangled behind her teeth like brambles she'd ignored too long. This time, she didn't just stack the crates and turn back down the ridge. She stood there on the creaking porch, one hand resting on the rail where he'd once left her, that tiny jar of honey. Her voice came out hoarse, raw from too many miles of silence. I'm not just a mule, Elias Grant. You can't keep me on these trails forever. The door stayed shut, as it always did. No footsteps, no shadow in the window, only the hush of wind slipping between the logs. Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the letter she'd written the night before. 3 pages, folded so many times the paper had softened at the creases. Words she'd tried to bury, her frustration, the way the cold rides shotgun with her every mile up this mountain. The ache of never knowing if the small gestures meant anything more than loneliness, echoing against loneliness. "I don't know if you even read these," she'd written, ink smudged where her thumb pressed too hard. "Maybe I'm just hauling hope up this ridge every month. Maybe you don't feel anything at all. But if you do, if any of this means something, then you need to show it, or I need to stop looking for ghosts in your porch rail." She tucked the letter under the corner of the crate stacked with oats and nails. For a long moment she stood there, eyes fixed on the cabin's dark window. Then she tipped her hat, not out of courtesy, but because it felt like drawing a line she might never cross again. Back in her tiny rented room above the cooper's shop, Clara lay awake that night staring at the cracked ceiling. "Am I just lonely?" she asked the dark. "Is he? Is this real?" When she returned 2 weeks later, the new supply list was as curt as ever. Salt, candles, seed grain. But pressed flat between the folded parchment, so delicate it almost fell apart in her fingers, was a single violet, dried but still carrying the ghost of spring. The snow came early that year, drifting down from cross pine in cold sheets that made the trail vanish if you blinked too long. Clara Hawke felt it long before she saw it. That needling on the back of her neck, the way the mule's ears twitched too sharply at every snap of brush. Someone was back there, dogging her wagon's slow climb toward Elias Grant's ridge. She kept her hand near the old rifle tucked under the bench seat, but her heart thudded harder than the wind whipping down the pass. The ridge was only an hour ahead when the mule balked, refusing to take another step. Clara jumped down, boots crunching in the icy ruts, and that's when he stepped from the tree line. A man in a ragged coat, hat pulled low, one boot torn at the sole. His grin was wide, but his eyes were mean, a smirk twisted by too many lost wages and bottles of cheap rye. "Evening, Miss Hawke. Going to Grant's, huh? You got what he owes me in that wagon?" She backed up, rifle half raised. "I don't know you, and you're not taking anything." But he lunged. Too fast, too close. The rifle clattered from her frozen hands as he shoved her into the wagon side. Her head struck the wood with a sickening crack. She tasted iron, felt snow soaking through her coat as she crumpled. The last thing she saw was her red shawl snagging on the wagon rail as the man tore open the crates. Miles away, Elias Grant's boot prints cut deep into fresh snow. He'd read the supply list, seen Clara's careful note, "Final run before the pass closes." But dusk had come and gone, and her wagon never crested the ridge. Now every snapped branch, every churned hoof mark told him more than words ever could. Then he found it, that scrap of red shawl, half buried under pine needles. He pressed it to his lips once, then shoved it in his coat and kicked his horse hard. His revolver swung at his hip, heavy and familiar in his grip. He found her near the bend where the trail split toward the old mine. The thief had dragged her aside like discarded freight. Crates busted open, flour bleeding into the snow. Elias didn't hesitate. He came off the horse like a thunderclap, tackling the man into the frozen mud. Fists crashed, boots slipped, curses tore the air. Somewhere in the shadows Clara drifted, half conscious, her mind flickering to the sound of her mother's lullaby, the weight of her husband's coffin, and the smell of pine that always clung to Elias's porch. And through it all, the grunts and gasps of a man fighting like he'd never learned how to lose. Clara woke to the soft pop of firewood, the world blurry around the edges. Her head throbbed like a hammer against old barn boards. The scent of pine and smoke grounded her more than the rough blanket tucked under her chin. Somewhere close she heard a chair creak. When her eyes focused, Elias Grant sat hunched by the hearth, his coat draped over his knees, his big hands still smeared with her dried blood. He didn't speak when her eyes found him. He only leaned forward, took her chilled hand in both of his, and let his thumb trace her knuckles as if he had to remind himself she was real. She drifted back under the fever's pull. When she woke again, dawn bled through the cabin window, pale, merciless light on the wood floor. She pushed the blanket aside, swung her legs down. The room tilted and lurched like a wagon on a ditch bank. "Elias," she rasped, but he was already there. Clara's knees buckled halfway to the door. His arms caught her before the floor could bruise her again. She could feel the tight knot of his jaw where his cheek brushed her hair. "I'm not letting you break, Clara," he murmured into the crown of her head. His voice was so low she felt it more than heard it, a promise ironed flat by years of silence, now spoken because he couldn't hold it in anymore. He eased her back to bed, wrapped her up tight, then ladled broth from a dented pot hanging over the coals. She watched him spoon it gently to her lips, like she was something too precious to spill. Later, when the cabin fell into its usual hush, Elias rummaged through the saddlebags she'd dropped near the door. His fingers brushed a small bundle tied with frayed twine. Wild lavender, brittle but still fragrant. He lifted it, turning to her where she lay curled in the quilt. "For you?" he asked roughly. Clara's eyes softened, exhaustion and truth warring in her throat. "For the cabin," she said, her voice a rasp but her meaning clear. "To keep the shadows out." Elias didn't answer. He just placed the lavender on the windowsill above her bed, a single bright promise against all the quiet waiting outside their door. The fire had burned low, a thin glow licking at the edges of the stone hearth. Clara sat stiff in the old rocking chair, her arms folded tight, every muscle braced against the words she'd swallowed for too long. Elias stood across from her, one hand braced on the mantel as if the wood itself might splinter under his grip. When she finally spoke, her voice came out hard, bitter as iron. "You hide up here like I'm just your hired mule. You think I don't know what this is? You send lists, you fix my wagon wheel, you patch me up, but you don't let me in." "Not really. I'm just another freight line to you, Elias Grant, a pack mule with a heartbeat." He flinched just once, his eyes narrowing the way storms gather before they break. "You want to talk about hiding?" His voice was rough, scraping out years of rust. "You run from what you want because you're scared it'll leave you, same as he did. So don't stand there telling me I'm the only coward in this cabin." The air crackled, louder than the hiss of the coals. Clara's breath came ragged now, her fingers digging crescent moons into her sleeves. "I am tired, Elias. Tired of being half here, half somewhere else. Tired of wondering if this—" She gestured at the cabin walls, the empty shadows between them. "Means anything to you. I can't keep hauling my heart up this ridge if you won't meet me halfway." Elias turned, boots creaking against the warped planks, his shoulders trembling as if the words cost him more than any cattle or acres he'd ever lost. "You think I don't lie awake afraid you'll stop coming? That one day I'll watch that trail and you won't be there? You're the only thing I got left that wasn't bought or stolen or sold off piece by piece." Neither spoke after that. Instead, Clara slid down from the chair to the floor, her back against the rough wall. Elias sank down beside her, boots stretched out, shoulders brushing hers. Their fingers found each other in the dark space between. No promises, just the steady warmth of two people finally too tired to lie. Cedar Hollow felt smaller than ever the day Clara Hawke didn't hitch her wagon for Crosspine. The townsfolk noticed, of course. They always did. The supply clerk squinted at the empty hitch rail, muttering to himself. The women at the bakery leaned in closer, words thick with sugar and spite. Clara stayed inside her rented room above the cooper's shop, staring out the window at the muddy street below, wondering if the silence on that ridge even noticed she'd stopped coming. She didn't see him ride in, but everyone else did. Old Ben the blacksmith was the first to feel the hush settle like a heavy quilt across the square. He looked up from his anvil, hammer dangling forgotten in his big fist. The figure on horseback was unmistakable, tall in the saddle, coat torn at the cuff, boots caked in ridge mud. Elias Grant looked like the ghost of the man they'd once called the Basin King, only more real now, more carved down to the bone. People stopped in their tracks. A boy dropped a sack of grain at his father's feet. Mrs. Lucille Holloway clutched her apron to her chest, whispering behind her teeth. It had been years since the richest man in the basin had stepped off that mountain. Most figured he'd never do it again. Ben wiped sweat and soot from his brow, a slow grin cracking the gruff lines of his face. "About damn time you came down that ridge, boy." Elias didn't answer. He swung down from the horse in one practiced motion and tied the reins to the post outside the cooper's door. Then he climbed the narrow back steps, boots echoing on the weathered boards. He took off his hat before he knocked, like he wasn't sure he deserved the right to wear it in her presence. When Clara opened the door, her breath caught in her chest. He looked tired, raw in the eyes, stubble shading the sharp lines of his jaw. He swallowed once, voice low but steady. I can buy every fence from here to the Missouri, Clara Hawke. Every acre, every wagon, every damn ridge. But I can't buy you. I don't want to. And I won't stand up there waiting to lose you either. She didn't answer. Not with words anyway. She stepped aside, leaving the door open wide. The creek behind Cross Pine was still half choked with frost, but the clearing beside it breathed like spring had finally cracked open its ribs. Clara Hawke stood barefoot in the thawing grass, hem of her cotton dress damp and clinging to her ankles. Her hair, loose for once, was pulled back with a single blue ribbon, the one Elias had found at the bottom of her old trunk, worn soft but still bright as a wildflower in his palm. They had no preacher, no polished ring, no organ music to drown out the creek's gurgle, just neighbors from Cedar Hollow. The blacksmith, old Ben, who brought a kettle of strong coffee and a stack of warm biscuits wrapped in a flowered cloth. Lucille Holloway's stale pie found its way onto a tree stump, and a pair of boys with mismatched boots chased each other through the brush, fists full of daisies they'd plucked from the creek's muddy banks. Elias stood beside her, coat sleeves rolled, hair damp from where he'd dipped his head in the cold creek that morning, as if washing away the ghosts he'd kept locked up on that ridge for too long. He held Clara's hand. Rough palms, the same ones that had mended her wheel, held her steady, fought for her life. It was Ben who lifted his calloused hand and said it plain, voice steady but warm as the sunrise pushing through the tree line. By the witness of these hills, this sky, and these folks, you're man and wife. Ain't no paper needs to say it truer. They didn't kiss right away, just smiled, tears pooling, until laughter from the children broke the hush and the world remembered how to spin. Later, Clara let Elias pull her into a clumsy dance in the churned-up grass, feet muddy, her head resting on his shoulder while the fiddle some boy plucked at let out a single string's sweet, sour note. That night, with the clearing empty and the pie plate licked clean by the strays, Elias pressed something cool but warm from his hand into hers. A ring, rough-hewn iron, shaped from an old gate latch he'd pulled from his cabin door. It fit clumsy but true. At dawn, they stood on the porches side by side, watching the patch of earth they'd turned last fall, where green shoots now poked brave through the thawed soil. Clara's voice came quiet but sure. Not for the gold, not for the land, just for this, Elias answered, his thumb brushing the iron band on her finger. Just you, just us. When the frost lifts and the soil softens, even the loneliest roots find a way to bloom again. That's the simple truth at the heart of Clara and Elias's story. Maybe you see a piece of your own life here. The heartbreak you once thought would bury you. The way trust can feel impossible after betrayal. The fear of letting someone see who you really are when you've been strong for too long. Out here on the frontier, folks learned early that love wasn't a grand gesture or a signed deed. It was a hand reaching out in the quiet, saying, I'm staying, no matter what. In a world today that moves faster than a horse can run, maybe we need that reminder. That what lasts isn't what we buy or build. It's what we're willing to mend together when the storms come through. Would you have chosen to stay like Clara did, or would you have ridden down that ridge and never looked back? Do you believe a man like Elias, with so many scars and so much pride, can truly change? Or do ghosts always find a way to drag us back? Tell us down in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories and what you'd have done on that porch, in that clearing, with a simple iron ring forged by hand. Thank you for listening all the way through this quiet, stubborn tale. If these Wild West love stories speak to something inside you, a longing for trust that doesn't come with a price tag, then please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share it with someone who might need that hope too. Until the next story, may your fences hold strong, your hearth stay warm, and may you always find someone worth staying for.